June 25, 1876. Late morning, maybe 11:30. The grass along the Little Bighorn River is already thigh-high and gone that pale gold color it turns in a Montana summer. And out in that grass, flat on his stomach, is a young Cheyenne warrior nobody in Washington has ever heard of and nobody ever will. He's got dust on his knuckles and sweat-cutting lines down through the dirt on his neck, and cradled against his shoulder is a rifle with a brass frame that's picking up the sun a little too well for his liking. He shifts it lower into the grass. Somewhere less than a mile away, a cavalry column is moving, and in about 20 minutes, the gun in this unremarkable young man's hands is going to help turn George Armstrong Custer into the most famous loser in American military history. So here's what you're actually getting today. This is the real story of the Henry rifle. Not the movie version, not the saloon door version, but the one that comes out of patent filings, ordnance records, soldiers' letters, and, yes, spent brass dug out of a Montana hillside by archaeologists more than 100 years later. This is a gun that started in a cramped Connecticut workshop, got dismissed by the US Army, got bought anyway by soldiers with their own money because it could flat out outshoot anything else on a Civil War battlefield. And then, and this is the part Hollywood tends to skip, ended up putting more firepower into the hands of the US Army's enemies than into the hands of the Army itself. That's not a twist I'm inventing for drama. That's just what the record shows. Now, before we get into the blood and the brass, let's talk about where this thing actually came from, because the origin is stranger than you'd think. If you're enjoying this deep dive already, go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe, because we've barely loaded the first round. The man whose name is stamped on this rifle was Benjamin Tyler Henry, and here's the first honest surprise. He wasn't rich, he wasn't a soldier, and he wasn't even really in charge. He was a machinist, a skilled one, sure, the kind of guy who could look at a jammed mechanism and know exactly which part was cut a 1/16 of an inch too thin, working for a struggling little outfit called the New Haven Arms Company. His actual boss was a shirt manufacturer turned firearms investor named Oliver Winchester. And it's Winchester's name you know today, not Henry's, which tells you something about how credit tends to work out in business. Henry took an earlier, clunky repeating rifle design, the old volcanic system, which fired an underpowered little self-contained round that barely had the punch to hurt a man past 30 feet, and he rebuilt it almost from scratch. He redesigned the cartridge into a proper 44 caliber rimfire round with real black powder behind it. He redesigned the toggle link action that cycled it, and in October of 1860, he patented what we now call the Henry rifle. Here's what made it different, and I want you to actually picture this, not just hear the numbers. A soldier in 1860 carrying a standard muzzle-loading rifled musket, the kind most of the Civil War would be fought with, had to bite open a paper cartridge, pour powder down the barrel, ram a bullet down on top of it, prime the pan or cap the nipple, cock the hammer, and fire. One shot. Then start over. A well-drilled soldier, moving fast under pressure, might get off 3 rounds in a minute. Some historians push that to 4 if the man was exceptional and not panicking, which, let's be honest, is a big if when people are shooting back at you. Now picture the Henry. 15 rounds loaded into a brass tube that ran underneath the barrel, plus 1 more you could drop into the chamber if you wanted every possible shot. 16 total before you ever had to stop and reload. You worked a lever under the trigger guard, which ejected the spent case, cocked the hammer, and fed a fresh round into the chamber, all in one motion. A man who knew what he was doing could empty that entire tube in under a minute. Some period accounts and modern recreations put it as high as 28 rounds a minute, though historians still argue about exactly how fast the best trained hands could really run it under real combat stress, versus what they could do calm and dry firing on a range. Even taking the conservative end of that range, you're talking about a weapon that could put out somewhere close to 10 times the sustained fire of the standard infantry rifle of its era. Translate that into something you can actually feel. Imagine everyone else in the fight is stuck reloading a bolt-action hunting rifle by hand between every single shot, and you're the one guy standing there with something that fires like a modern semi-automatic. That's the gap we're talking about. That's not a small edge. That's a different category of weapon walking onto a battlefield built for muskets. The Army, to its credit or its shame, depending how you look at it, wasn't sure what to do with it. Ordnance officials worried, not unreasonably, that soldiers with 16 shots in their hands would burn through ammunition faster than supply wagons could keep up, especially with a young Green Army that didn't always have the fire discipline of veterans. So the Henry was never officially adopted as standard infantry issue. But soldiers, being soldiers, didn't really care what the quartermaster thought. Men in certain regiments, most famously several companies of the 7th Illinois Volunteer Infantry, pooled their own pay and bought Henry rifles privately at a price that could run more than a month's wages for a private soldier because they'd rather go broke than go into a fight outgunned. And here's where we get one of those lines that's become almost gospel in Old West lore, so let's flag it honestly. Legend has it that Confederate soldiers on the receiving end of Henry fire started calling it that damned Yankee rifle they load on Sunday and shoot all week. It's a great line. It shows up in book after book, but there's no solid contemporary document, no diary entry, no newspaper clipping from 1863 that historians can actually point to as the original source. It might be real. It might have been invented decades later by someone selling books. We genuinely don't know. What we do know, from actual ordnance records and after-action reports, is that wherever Henry rifles showed up in numbers, Confederate officers wrote home complaining about facing what they described as an almost unbelievable rate of fire coming out of a handful of men. All right, quick pause, because we're coming up on the part of this story that most people have never heard, and it's the part that actually matters most. If this kind of record versus legend breakdown is what you come here for, now's a good time to hit subscribe, because the next stretch is where this story stops being about a factory in Connecticut and starts being about a hillside in Montana. After the Civil War ended, New Haven Arms reorganized in 1866 into a company you've definitely heard of, Winchester Repeating Arms, and the Henry evolved into the Winchester Model 1866, nicknamed the Yellow Boy for its brass receiver, and later the even more famous Model 1873. But thousands of original Henry rifles and the wave of Winchester repeaters that followed them didn't just vanish after the war. They flooded into a surplus market. Traders sold them. Settlers carried them west. And this is the uncomfortable part the legend usually leaves out. Native American tribes acquired them too, through trade, through purchase, and yes, through battlefield capture, all across the 1860s and 70s. By the time we reached the mid-1870s, on the northern plains, it was entirely possible, common even, for Lakota and Cheyenne warriors to be carrying repeating rifles while the soldiers sent to fight them were carrying something a full generation behind. Which brings us back to that young man in the grass. By 1876, the U.S. Army's standard cavalry weapon was the Springfield Model 1873 carbine, a single-shot breech-loading rifle firing a much more powerful .45-70 round, a real improvement over a Civil War musket, no argument there. But it was still one shot, then a manual reload every single time, and it had a known mechanical flaw. The soft copper cartridge cases it used could expand in the chamber under heat and pressure and jam solid, sometimes requiring a soldier to dig the spent case out with a knife blade in the middle of a firefight. Meanwhile, archaeologists working the Little Bighorn battlefield more than a century later, using metallic cartridge analysis, matching firing pin markings on thousands of recovered shell casings, found something that reshaped how historians understand that day. A significant number of the casings scattered across the field came from repeating rifles, Henrys, and the newer Winchester Model 1866s and 1873s that descended directly from Henry's original design. Historians still debate the exact ratio of repeaters to single-shot weapons on the Lakota and Cheyenne side that morning, and probably always will, since no one was standing there with a clipboard counting. But the physical evidence on the ground is not in dispute. This was not a fight where one side had a firepower advantage because of tactics or terrain. One side, in raw mechanical terms, could shoot roughly 5 to 10 times faster than the other, gun for gun, hand for hand. So let's walk through what that actually looked like, because this is the moment the whole story has been building to. Custer split his roughly 600-man 7th Cavalry Regiment into detachments that morning, moving to strike what he believed was a smaller encampment than the one actually spread along the river, a village that, by many estimates, held somewhere in the range of 6,000 to 7,000 people, with a fighting force that may have run to 1,500 to 2,000 warriors, though again, exact numbers are still argued over by historians today. Custer personally led roughly 210 men north along a ridgeline, intending to hit the village from above. What he rode into instead was a rapidly assembling force of warriors who'd already turned back 2 other detachments and were now free to converge on him. Picture the terrain, dry, rolling grassland cut by ravines and coulees that could hide a man completely until he was 50 yards away, under a hard, cloudless Montana sun with almost no cover and no water. Custer's troopers were exhausted, their horses spent from a fast overnight march, many of them likely dehydrated and running on adrenaline and fear rather than food. And now imagine you're one of those soldiers. You fire your Springfield, you work the trapdoor breech open, your hands slick with sweat, maybe shaking, and you try to punch out the spent case, and it sticks. You're clawing at your own rifle with a knife while, somewhere in that grass or behind that ridge, a warrior with a Henry or a Winchester in his hands is putting round after round downrange without ever breaking his rhythm to reload. That is not a fair fight in the way we usually picture fair fights in this era. That is one side essentially still fighting the Civil War, while the other side is fighting with what amounts to the future. Historians estimate the fighting on Custer's portion of the field, the actual last stand phase, lasted somewhere between 20 minutes and just over an hour, with most modern assessments leaning toward the shorter end, something close to half an hour of close, chaotic, brutal combat at ranges that in places closed to under 50 feet. Every one of the roughly 210 men with Custer that day was killed. Not wounded and captured, killed. It remains, to this day, one of the worst tactical defeats the United States Army has ever suffered in the field. And while there were plenty of reasons for it, Custer's own decisions, the terrain, the sheer size of the encampment he'd underestimated, the mismatch in rate of fire, the direct descendant of Benjamin Henry's little brass-framed rifle from a Connecticut workshop 16 years earlier, was sitting right there in the archaeological record as one of the reasons why. And that's the part of this story that ought to sit with you for a second. A gun built by Union sympathizers, financed by a northern businessman, marketed as the rifle that would help win the war for the United States. That same design, one generation later, through nothing more sinister than open trade and a free market in surplus firearms, ended up arming the very people the United States Army was sent out to defeat, and helped hand that army its most infamous single-day defeat in its history. The West wasn't a clean story of good guns and bad guys, of civilization marching west with superior technology in its back pocket. Sometimes the most advanced weapon on the field wasn't in the hands of the army wearing the uniform at all. Sometimes it was in the hands of an anonymous man lying flat in the grass, who nobody in Washington ever thought to ask what he was carrying. That's the real story of the Henry rifle. Not a legend, not a movie prop, but a mechanical idea that outran the intentions of everyone who built it. If you want more of these real history versus Hollywood myth breakdowns, hit that subscribe button, drop a like if this one surprised you, and send it to somebody you know who thinks they've already heard the real story of the Old West. Trust me, they haven't heard this part. I'll see you in the next one.